Good evening, everybody. Welcome, very warm welcome. My name's Adam Smith. I'm the director of the Rothermere American Institute. This is one of the REI's great annual events, the Winant Lecture, and it's splendid to see so many of you here. Before I introduce Professor Zackin, this year's Winant lecturer, I want to first of all just acknowledge the work that's been done in helping to put this lecture together to support this event this evening from our colleagues Katie Long and Josh and Hannah and Dan. And I want to thank the generosity of the Winant family, specifically the late Rivington Winant and Joan Winant, who have endowed the Winant Professorship in honour of Rivington's father, John Gilbert Winant, who was a progressive Republican governor of New Hampshire, appointed by FDR to be the ambassador to the Court of St. James in the midst of the Blitz. Winant did more than anyone did as much as anyone to forge the basis for an Anglo-American alliance based on shared defence of liberal democracy. Ambassador Winant observed an editorial in the Times in 1942 has become a symbol of the very best side of America. And we're very proud to host this prestigious professorship here at the Rothermere American Institute, which has brought to Oxford over the years a series of very distinguished political scientists, including this year's professor, Emily Zackin, widely regarded as the most brilliant scholar of American political development of her generation. Her first book, Looking for Rights in All the Wrong Places, Why State Constitutions Contain America's Positive Rights, published in 2013, is an intellectual tour de force. It shows that positive rights are not best sought in the federal constitution, but in the state constitutions, of which there have been 149 since 1776. Emily's second book, co-authored with Chloe Thurston, is The Political Development of American Debt Relief, a major intervention into the political economy of consumer and household debt in the United States. The book explains how indebted citizens have organised politically to seek government protection from accumulated financial indebtedness. She's published in the top journals in political science and in law, including the American Political Science Review and the Chicago Law Review. She significantly advanced scholarly understanding of the place of legal and constitutional structures in the process of American political development. No one rivals her contribution to the study of law and politics working in this field. And I want to add as well that since coming to Oxford, Emily has been absolutely at the heart of our community here in the REI, contributing with huge intellectual generosity to seminars, supporting early career scholars, and in every way living up to the very distinguished line of predecessors, including one in this room, who have preceded her in this chair. So Emily, thank you for being here this year. We're very privileged to have you here, and I'd like to invite you now to deliver the 2026 John G. Winant Lecture in American Government, entitled States and American Constitutional Development.
Thank you, Adam, for that extraordinarily touching introduction. And before I begin, I need to extend several other heartfelt thank yous as well. First to the Winant family, next to the Master Dame Helen Ghosh and the fellows and staff of Balliol College. Thanks to everyone here at the RAI, including Professors Adam Smith, Desmond King, Daniel Rowe, and Katie Long, Hannah Grieving, and Josh Alexander. Robert Lieberman, Elijah Gould, Grace Mallon, and Tom Arnold Foster have all talked through various elements of this lecture with me. I could not have asked for a warmer welcome to Oxford or a more enriching intellectual environment in which to spend the year. Okay, with that, let's turn to the role of states in American constitutional development. As Adam said, the U.S. states have collectively ratified almost 150 constitutions, and held over 230 constitutional conventions. I hope to convince you today that we cannot understand America's constitutional development without attending to them, and to state lawmaking more generally. In fact, let me put that point even more strongly. Because scholars of America's constitutional politics have focused almost exclusively on the federal Constitution and the federal government, we have made several serious mistakes. The first is to imagine that constitutions necessarily empower judges, or that constitutionalizing an issue means that it will get worked out in a court. This is a point about the design of constitutional law and how we govern with constitutions. The second mistake is not about how constitutions work, but about their content. Here I want to convince you that America's constitutionalism not only serves to restrain the state, to protect private economic activity from state intervention, but also to demand welfare-oriented intervention and protective government. Finally, I want to suggest a different way of thinking about U.S. federalism. Rather than seeing states as independent laboratories or as reactive sites of popular backlash, we should understand them as targets of coordinated, nationwide political movements, especially for those movements that are losing at the federal level. These three categories of U.S. constitutional politics, how American constitutions work, what they say, and the nature of American federalism structure my remarks today. And by the end of this lecture, I hope to convince you that states are not simply an additional site of American constitutional activity, but that state lawmaking is one of the primary mechanisms through which even federal constitutional meaning is generated and altered. But before I dive in too deeply, let me start with a quick distinction. Phew. This lecture is about constitutional development rather than constitutional law. Constitutional development includes the work of constitutional drafters and courts, but it is a broader category, encompassing the wide range of activities that shape constitutional texts and exert pressure on their meaning and operation. Constitutional politics is lived, not only written, and there can be big gaps between judicial pronouncements of what is constitutionally permissible and what is actually happening on the ground. Studying only constitutional texts and the decisions of courts as they interpret them can rarely tell us all we would want to know about how controversies are being fought and settled, or how the U.S. constitutional system has changed over time. I understand this study of constitutional development to be an empirical project. So it's not an argument about how we should draft or read constitutions, but about how the system has changed over time and why. With that, let me turn to the design misconception, to the relationship between courts and constitutions. And let's begin with the conventional wisdom about how constitutions work. A very famous metaphor in constitutional theory likens constitutional provisions to the ropes that bound Ulysses to the mast of his ship. Knowing that he would be tempted to steer his vessel into dangerous waters, Ulysses ensured ahead of time that some choices would remain unavailable to him. Constitutions, like the ropes that bound Ulysses, are self-imposed limitations. We commit in advance to restraints that can save our ship of state from dangerous shoals, from the risky impulses of the moment. In its most general terms, I think this is a useful way to understand the practice of constitutionalism. It is a project of collective pre-commitment to take or avoid a particular course. Constitutional theorists, though, have not only emphasized the importance of pre-commitment, but also the long-term stability of those commitments. A dominant theme of the literature is, in fact, that constitutions, to be successful, must establish commitments durable enough to bind across generations. This entrenchment function is often described as a defining feature, perhaps even the central purpose of a constitution. But this textual stability, the text is to stay the same over a long period of time, it requires textual generality. In other words, a constitutional text that stays the same for many generations can only be drawn in broad strokes, because you have to leave out the things that you will expect will need adjustment over time. As Justice John Marshall famously remarked, only the Constitution's great outlines should be marked, its important objects designated, and the minor ingredients which compose those objects be deduced from the nature of those objects themselves. This is, I think, a significant use of the passive voice. Who is it, we might well ask, that will do this work of deduction? The Supreme Court will likely have an important role. Indeed, many theorists, and certainly many Supreme Court justices, have argued that the Supreme Court has the ultimate authority to answer such constitutional questions. So now you have the full picture of constitutionalism, as most of the theoretical literature portrays it. Constitutional documents are envisioned as high-level outlines. These sparse texts are relatively stable and are interpreted by constitutional courts, who determine how their general instructions apply to particular circumstances. You will, of course, immediately recognize that this is how the US Constitution looks and functions. So far, so good. But here's where things get sticky. Because the US Constitution has been so central to generations of scholarship, constitutional theorists typically posit that constitutions are, by definition, broad, stable texts that usher the judiciary into the policymaking process. In other words, constitutionalism, we are told, empowers judges. Yet, US state constitutions work quite differently. They are detailed rather than spare, and their texts are flexible rather than stable. The median state constitution is about 5 times longer than the US Constitution. The median lifespan of a state constitution, measured from adoption to wholesale replacement, is around 44 years. And amendment is a regular feature of state constitutional politics. So, what are we to make of these very different constitutions? One option is to dismiss them as failures, to assume that their drafters simply didn't understand how to write constitutions. The New York Constitution's ski trails provision is emblematic of this critique. As one critic wrote in an article entitled "The Failed Discourse of State Constitutionalism," what can one say about the character of a people who enshrine these types of provisions in their constitutions? That they are a people who cherish their liberty to ski? But a careful look at the origins of this provision demonstrates that its adoption was a deliberate and recognizable exercise in constitutional pre-commitment. So let me sketch that story for you very briefly. At the end of the 19th century, widespread concern emerged in New York State about the future of the state's forests. The Forest Commission, responsible for preserving these lands, was chaired by a lumber baron, and the state legislature continually authorized extensive logging. But the Constitutional Convention of 1894 seemed to offer a solution. Since the legislature and its Forest Commission had proven themselves unreliable guardians of the forest's future, the convention adopted a constitutional provision that deprived the commission, and even the legislature, of discretion over the management of this land. The provision not only mandated that the area in question be forever kept as wild forest land, but also permanently forbade the removal of any timber. In 1938, the Forever Wild provision was then carried over into the state's next constitution, and when the government wanted to build ski trails, it was widely understood that a constitutional amendment would be necessary to carve out an exception to the Forever Wild provision. This episode demonstrates 2 important points. First, the inclusion of these policy details was not a mistake or a lapse in higher order lawmaking. On the contrary, through the Forever Wild provision, New Yorkers tied their own hands and those of their representatives. And then, in light of changing circumstances, they revised those bounds. Although the form of New York's Constitution is different from the one most constitutional theory has led us to expect, its function is very much the same. Second, this is an example of the way that constitutional specificity goes hand in hand with constitutional flexibility. This detailed instruction, never to remove timber from the state's forest, necessitated further, even more detailed changes to the Constitution. Now, the champions of this Forever Wild provision were mainly concerned with exercising control over the legislature. But many proponents of constitutional detail were hoping to limit the discretion and policymaking power of courts. Their goal was not to empower courts through constitutions, but to reduce judicial discretion over the meaning of these texts and over the policies they describe. This was especially true of constitutional politics at the turn of the 20th century and up through the New Deal. Populists and progressives harbored a general antipathy toward judges because courts routinely declared their legislative victories unconstitutional. I've worked in particular on the labor movement in this period, in which courts were generally skeptical of workmen's compensation laws, maximum hours legislation, minimum wage laws, the list goes on. And it drove movement leaders crazy that they could get these labor laws passed by a legislature only to have courts strike them down. As I hope you are by now anticipating, labor organizations guarded against the threat of judicial nullification by addressing these policy details directly in the text of state constitutions. New York's 1913 Constitution read, "Nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to limit the power of the legislature to set up a system of workmen's compensation." Similarly, in 1936, the Montana Labor News described the need for an amendment to the Montana Constitution that could safeguard the many maximum hours laws that had already been passed to protect workers across a variety of industries. This outlet explained, "All of these laws that have been passed by the legislature are subject to challenge by the courts. All of these 8-hour laws may be destroyed by the corporations unless you pass this 8-hour amendment." And above is the big banner headline that ran when the 8-hour amendment was approved by a statewide vote in 1936. We can think of this iterative provision of very specific instructions as a kind of constitutional micromanagement. We might also think of it as a form of direct democracy. In fact, several of the turn-of-the-century movements that employed this constitutional strategy were also keen to adopt the initiative and referendum and judicial recall, institutional innovations designed to place the reins of power directly in the hands of the electorate, circumventing legislatures that reformers argued were corrupt, and preventing judges from serving elites at the expense of electoral majorities. Here's a picture, I don't know if you can read this, of the honest voter wielding the initiative and referendum to drive dishonest politicians, or boodlers, and those who would bribe them from the State House. But even before these reform movements, and as early as the first decades of the 19th century, state constitutional drafters had already begun to adopt this strategy. And as they did, state constitutions got longer and longer, their texts filled with more and more details. Now we know that specificity requires flexibility, so as they grew more detailed, these texts also got less stable. Here, my co-author Mila Versteeg and I calculated an entrenchment score for each state in each year by dividing the total number of years the state had been in existence by the total number of years in which the Constitution had been altered through either amendment or replacement. This is a highly imperfect measure, but I do think it captures the reality that state constitutional texts were being tinkered with more and more frequently over the course of U.S. history, rendering them less and less entrenched. Incidentally, this is how the world's constitutions have developed too. Like U.S. state constitutions, these documents have grown more detailed and less entrenched over time. To be clear, there are many well-founded normative concerns about the initiative and referendum in particular, and about flexible constitutions more generally. For instance, stable texts are probably better equipped to protect minority rights than those that are frequently adjusted through majoritarian procedures. My claim is not that this model of constitutionalism is superior, but that we need to rethink the essential attributes of written constitutions. They need not be, and in fact, they generally are not, spare or stable texts, and they can disempower judges rather than empower them. This is precisely how generations of reformers have used state constitutions. And of course, as reform movements changed the form of state constitutions, they also influenced their content. Which brings me to the second misconception I want to address today. A great deal of work about the American constitutional tradition has emphasized that constitutional government in the United States is committed exclusively to laissez-faire liberalism rather than redistributive government, to the preservation of private property rather than the protection of vulnerable people. To the extent that the United States did commit itself to welfare-oriented or redistributive government, we typically think this was through statutes rather than constitutions. And we typically think of those statutes as a product of FDR's New Deal, a response to the Great Depression and the pressures of industrialization. Constitutionalism, by contrast, is said to protect Americans from tyrannical government by forcing the government to restrain itself. Now, the Federal Bill of Rights does create this impression. You'll recognize here the First, Fourth, and Eighth Amendments and the list of restraints they impose. But the Bill of Rights is not where you would expect to find mandates for governmental intervention. It was, after all, drafted to satisfy those who were worried about too much intervention by a new and potentially oppressive central government. We cannot infer from this document that Americans were suspicious of all government, and especially not that this was the only sentiment they enshrined as a matter of constitutional law. In fact, we should not make this inference from the federal constitution at all, since the government it created was layered atop existing state governments. And it was these subnational governments that were understood to be responsible for the vast majority of economic and social regulation well into the 20th century. And indeed, we find state constitutions full of provisions that reflect these responsibilities, beginning with the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which declared it the duty of legislatures and magistrates in all future periods to cherish the interests of literature and the sciences and all seminaries of them, especially the University at Cambridge, Massachusetts, and public schools and grammar schools in the towns. Over the decades that followed, other states adopted education provisions, followed by debtors' rights, labor rights, and provisions on a host of other topics that instructed legislatures to intervene in social and economic life. Protective government was a particularly notable feature of Constitution writing at the turn of the 20th century. Just to give you one example, Alfalfa Bill Murray, president of Oklahoma's Constitutional Convention in 1906, addressed the convention in his opening remarks, declaring, "We should provide for the health and safety of the miners in the coal mines. We should provide for a regular day's labor of 8 hours. We shall provide for the protection of all laborers, whether in mines, factories, or on the railroad." Protective government is clearly a part of America's constitutional tradition. And here again, when we include state constitutions in our analysis, America's constitutional practices do not look all that different from those in the rest of the world. Just for fun, here are 3 pairs of constitutional provisions. One member of each pair was included in a national constitution somewhere outside the United States, and one was included in a US state constitution. Try to guess which is which to yourselves. I certainly couldn't have. Missouri's education provision from 1865 looks very much like this part of Belgium's constitution. I think the same is true for the labor and environmental rights here. But not only do these kinds of mandates for protective government exist at the state level, they have also shaped federal constitutionalism. In my second book, co-authored with Chloe Thurston, we make the argument that this constitutional commitment to protecting people from threats associated with poverty and economic stability is not confined to state constitutions. Even at the federal level, and even in the 19th century, long before the New Deal, the U.S. constitutional tradition came to reflect a concern for citizens facing economic precarity. We make that argument through the lens of bankruptcy law. The U.S. Constitution empowers Congress to establish uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcy. Here's the bankruptcy clause. Now, when this provision was written in the 18th century, bankruptcy was understood as a creditor's remedy. That is, a way for government to help lenders collect from people who owed them money. Bankruptcy was involuntary, which means the debtors did not choose to file for bankruptcy. Instead, creditors asked the court to declare debtors to be bankrupt, and it was not something you wanted to happen to you. But over the course of the 19th century, and in response to state-level pressures, Congress reinterpreted bankruptcy power, reading it not as a permission to help creditors alone, which was the original understanding, but as a grant of authority, perhaps even responsibility to protect the over-indebted as well. So I want to spend a little bit of time describing one such episode, the design of the Bankruptcy Act of 1867. This act was passed at the behest of Northern merchants, who in the wake of the Civil War were struggling to repay their own creditors, in part because they could not collect repayment from their Southern debtors. These Northerners asked for Congress's help, both to free them from their own debts and to help them collect from Southern debtors. But Southern and Western, what we would now call Midwestern states, already had debtor protections in place, known as homestead exemptions. These state laws protected certain types and amounts of property from forced sale for the repayment of debts, and their purpose was to allow debtors to keep their homes and farms no matter how much they owed to their creditors, even if they couldn't repay those debts. Here's the preamble to Georgia's law passed in 1841. It does not comport with the principles of justice, humanity, or sound policy to deprive the family of an unfortunate debtor of a home and the means of honest subsistence. And below it is a homestead exemption from the Michigan Constitution of 1850. The defenders of states' homestead exemptions argued that true freedom required at least some degree of economic independence and security, and that to achieve this security, it was necessary for government not to restrain itself or simply enforce private contracts, but to intervene in private contracts to ensure that ruinous debts were forgiven and that the over-indebted were not forced to sell their homes or farms. Westerners were very clear about the importance of homestead exemptions, and members of Congress from Western states refused to pass any bankruptcy bill that would supersede or undercut these state-level protections. Here's a petition to Congress from the citizens of Wisconsin. Recognizing that the federal legislature was likely to pass a bankruptcy act, they asked that the exemption laws of the several states be recognized. And this is my central point. Because states were already protecting debtors, Congress was forced to rethink what government owed to them, to reinterpret its own constitutional bankruptcy power. In 1867, it enacted a measure allowing debtors to secure a discharge from their debts while still taking advantage of whatever property exemptions their own states had enacted. This feature of federal bankruptcy law was included in every subsequent act and is still a feature of the Bankruptcy Code today. Protective treatment of debtors is part of a long constitutional tradition driven by state-level lawmaking that poses government not as the threat against which Americans must be protected, but as a protective force in its own right. But it is important to recognize that this tradition was always racially exclusionary. That is true of the movements for education and labor rights I discussed earlier. For instance, the Workingmen's Party that ran its own delegates for the election to the Constitutional Convention of 1879, then supported the Constitutional Convention in 1879, then supported the document's ratification, adopted the slogan, "The Chinese must go." It is also true of the Bankruptcy Act I just described. White Southern planters hated almost everything the federal government did during Reconstruction, but they were very enthusiastic about this law and filed for bankruptcy in large numbers. Southern newspapers of the period, like this one, were filled with notices of bankruptcy filings. As historian Elizabeth Thompson has documented, in the year following the law's enactment, there were 7 times as many bankruptcy filings per capita in the South as in any other region of the country. Even as the federal government freed white planters of their contractual obligations in the interests of ensuring that they could be meaningfully free citizens, it took a very different stance on the needs of black debtors. As Amy Drew Stanley has demonstrated, the Freedmen's Bureau defined freedom as the ability to contract, and in this case, to sell one's labor through a contract. Importantly, it turned a blind eye to the coercion that might result from these purportedly voluntary exchanges. Clinton Fisk, in his capacity as Assistant Commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, wrote a tract entitled Plain Counsels for Freedmen in 16 brief lectures. He devoted one of these lectures to the importance of contracts. And in it, he wrote, "It is much better in the long run to live up to a hard contract than to break it." The Freedmen's Bureau ensured that black farmers signed contracts with white landowners to farm for either wages or a share of the crop or profit at the end of the season. These tenancy and sharecropping arrangements and the state laws that grew up to entrench them famously used debt to re-subjugate black farmers to white landowners. Political scientists, including former Winant professor Robert Lieberman, who's with us today, have demonstrated that the 20th century's Social Security Act was designed to exclude black Southern workers. I see this work on America's 19th century commitments to welfare-oriented governance as extending that argument about racist exclusion from America's social safety net backward in time and outward to include the constitutional system more generally. At both the state and federal levels, America's constitutional tradition reflects a long-standing demand for economic protection. Americans haven't just pushed the state away, they have also demanded its help. But these demands and the policies they yielded were typically designed for the benefits of white citizens, frequently unavailable to those deemed non-white, and often secured through racial exclusion and exploitation. Let me switch now to the final section of this lecture, the section about federalism. Because, of course, it is their long history of racial oppression that often comes to mind when we think about U.S. states and constitutional politics. One standard lesson we could draw from state-level commitments to white supremacy is that it is forceful assertions of federal authority that have moderated this tendency and pulled the United States toward a more egalitarian constitutional order. I think this is inarguably true. Think, for example, of when President Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard to enforce the Supreme Court's mandate to desegregate schools in Brown v. Board of Education. This side of the federalism story is crucial to understanding America's constitutional development, and I think it has been told clearly and convincingly, notably by Professor Desmond King. In my most recent work, I too have been thinking about resistance to Brown and what it might have to teach us about federalism. And my sense is that the state-level side of this story, while well documented by historians, remains under-theorized by political scientists and constitutional scholars. Much of the time, the state-level response to the court is described somewhat vaguely as opposition from the states, and often as backlash. But I think this description might be somewhat misleading. Backlash connotes something pulled too far in one direction, recoiling, and possibly to an even more exaggerated position along the opposite trajectory. It suggests a knee-jerk reaction, an automatic spasm of grassroots outrage. And while there was certainly popular opposition to desegregation among white Southerners, the segregationist response to Brown was also a deliberate, long-term, and elite-driven strategy. And importantly for our purposes, it was a legal strategy. This is the piece that I think deserves more careful attention. Though there was certainly outright defiance, and on the right is the famous picture of Alabama Governor George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door to physically block integration. Much of the resistance in the South was achieved not through a refusal to follow the law, but through the production of law, through a coordinated legal movement. The Southern School News calculated that in the decade after Brown, state legislatures passed approximately 475 acts and resolutions related to segregation, the overwhelming majority of those in members of the former Confederacy. This barrage of state legislation had a somewhat scattershot quality. Some measures created schemes to fund private school tuition for white children, or to turn the state schools over to private actors to run. Others required the state to withhold public funds from segregated schools, or imposed criminal penalties for integrating schools. Some appropriated funds for the legal defense of public officials who refused to integrate. Legislatures also created pupil assignment laws, which directed school officials to assign students to schools based on a variety of facially neutral, though purposefully racialized criteria. Segregationists also secured several amendments to state constitutions. Some barred the legislature from providing funding to a school district that had integrated. Still others renounced the obligation to provide public education at all. In 1956, for instance, the Alabama Constitution was amended to clarify that, quote, "Nothing in this Constitution shall be construed as creating or recognizing any right to education or training at the public expense." Here again, state constitutional texts were tools in big national policy struggles. This is a phenomenon my co-author Mila Versteeg and I have dubbed rival lawmaking. Legally, the federal Constitution clearly sits above any state law that violates it. A lawyer would tell you that when the federal Constitution forbids some kind of state activity, that prohibition is supreme. That's why constitutional lawyers spend their time arguing about what the federal Constitution forbids or allows. But remember, our focus today is not on constitutional law, but on constitutional politics. Because state governments are answerable to their own electorates, craft their own constitutions, and establish their own statutes, these lawmaking institutions are available to political movements seeking to resist the Supreme Court's reading of the U.S. Constitution. Movements can use these institutions to create a body of law at the state level that exists in tension with Supreme Court doctrine. Through rival lawmaking, movements can protect their constitutional visions even after the Supreme Court has explicitly repudiated them, as it did in Brown. They can constrain the federal judiciary's influence over political change and constitutional development, and through this resistance, rival lawmakers can even reshape federal constitutional meanings. The one way these rival laws worked was that they allowed states' education officials to point to ambiguity, or at least purported ambiguity, in legal authority as the reason they could not desegregate. As the president of the Dallas School Board explained, "Our school board recognizes that there are moral and practical aspects of the matter of integration. But now, unfortunately, the scene is cluttered by complexities and conflicting laws, and this cannot be disregarded." Individually, each rival measure had limited force, but collectively, they imposed persistent pressure on the federal doctrine. In the end, this state-level constitutional politics reshaped the meaning of the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling. While resistance to Brown produced a reading of the 14th Amendment that didn't restore the old status quo, it did dramatically narrow Brown's transformative potential. In order to defend states' obstructionist measures in court, conservative advocates began to argue that Brown did not actually require integration, and that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause created only an individual right to ensure that one's race was not considered in one's own school assignment. Arguments like this, emphasizing the wrongs of classification based on race, rather than the subjugation and exclusion affected by segregated schooling, came to define the Supreme Court's 14th Amendment doctrine. And it is this reading of the 14th Amendment, as a prohibition on classification, rather than as an anti-subjugation measure, on which the court based its recent decision that affirmative action is unconstitutional. You will probably recognize a similar reaction to the Supreme Court's ruling in Roe v. Wade. State-level responses to Roe are also often described as backlash, but again, I think they are better understood as a reflection of a concerted movement to use states to probe the boundaries of Supreme Court doctrine, creating more and more space for state regulation of abortion. Between 1973, when the Supreme Court decided Roe, and 2022, when the court overturned it, states passed a breathtaking array of pro-life legislation. These laws included prohibitions for public funding of abortion, mandatory waiting periods, spousal and parental consent laws, and targeted regulation of abortion clinics, among many, many others. Most of these laws did not explicitly defy the holding in Roe, but they certainly tested the limits it placed on states' abilities to regulate. States butted up against Roe, asking again and again, is this allowed? What about this? What about this? And as a parent of an 8-year-old, I have to say this is a very familiar dynamic. Each time the Supreme Court accepted one of those state laws as constitutional, the court pulled Roe's boundary back and encouraged yet another wave of legislative boundary testing, followed by another court retreat. Following one court retreat in the 1989 case of Webster v. Reproductive Health Services, the Director of State Organizational Development at the National Right to Life Committee declared, "The counterattack begins. Today we present to the nation legislative initiatives that will set the agenda for the abortion debate in state legislatures throughout the country." Notice how state legislative initiatives are presented to the nation as a counterattack on a federal constitutional claim. Even more than for Brown, this legislative resistance to the Supreme Court was coordinated across state lines. One organization, Americans United for Life, offered hundreds of pieces of model legislation to the states. By one estimate, between 2010 and 2018 alone, over 400 abortion-related bills based on these model laws were introduced across 41 state legislatures. These laws did not merely sit within or alongside the federal framework established by Roe. Instead, they competed with and destabilized that framework, in part by further fueling the pro-life movement. Scholars of legal movements have demonstrated that even small or partial victories help to mobilize participation. And pro-life strategists recognize this as well, arguing that each state-level victory, though small, would contribute to the sense that their movement was ascendant. This rival body of law, in their own words, pushed Roe over the brink. And this is a book that the Americans United for Life published with this title. In a study of the conservative interest group ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, political scientist Alex Hertel-Fernandez very cleverly employed plagiarism detection software to demonstrate that ALEC's model bills had resulted in the widespread enactment of a slate of conservative laws in state legislatures. At its peak, around 2010, he estimates that state legislatures collectively passed somewhere between 1 and 200 laws based on ALEC's model legislation. That's in 1 year. But it's important to recognize that the tactic of disseminating model legislation and the larger dynamic through which national movements, finding that they have lost a federal battle, turn to states, is definitely not new, and neither is it inherently conservative. When activists for women's suffrage found that women would not be included in the 15th Amendment's right to the ballot, they continued to pursue an amendment to the federal Constitution. And at the same time, they worked state by state. This state-level strategy yielded the first successes, especially in Western states. Here's an image of Lady Liberty striding across the states from west to east, which appeared in Puck magazine's special suffrage issue in 1915. More prosaic, but perhaps more illustrative of the suffragist strategy is this map, published by the National Women's Suffrage Publishing Company in 1917. Individual state-level victories notched year by year, and they're recorded here on the sides of this map, allowed the suffrage movement to generate momentum, to build a national consensus in their favor, and to declare success even before the 19th Amendment added women's voting rights to the U.S. Constitution. Reformers fighting child labor also found their efforts at shaping federal law stymied, this time by the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 1918 struck down a federal law to combat child labor. These activists, too, responded with an increased focus on state lawmaking, even from within the federal government's Children's Bureau. Like the suffragists, the pro-life movement, and the segregationists, these opponents of child labor did pursue an amendment to the federal Constitution. And at the same time, they worked state by state, drafting and circulating model legislation. This map, produced by the Children's Bureau in 1926, reflects that strategy. And of course, this politics is still with us in the 21st century. You can recognize it in response to Dobbs. I took this map from the Center for Reproductive Rights website. As I think these maps convey, states were not performing their own self-contained experiments in solving social problems. Nor were their legislatures simply responding to grassroots spasms of backlash. States were instead targets of, venues for, nationwide opposition movements. Now, we are, of course, all aware of the high stakes of presidential nominations to the Supreme Court, and the way that social movements often attempt to influence the nominations process. In fact, scholars who have emphasized the central role of social movements in reshaping constitutional meaning have typically seen the Supreme Court as the targets of these movements. On this account, movements succeed in reshaping the Constitution by changing the court's mind, and especially by changing the composition of the court. And this is true. Shifts in Supreme Court personnel are often the proximate causes of major national shifts in federal constitutional meaning. But the deep roots of those developments frequently lie in and draw nourishment from state-level lawmaking. That's the federalism point with which I started this lecture. States as vehicles of national opposition movements, rather than isolated laboratories of democracy or sites of spontaneous backlash. As I near the end of this lecture, I hope I have convinced you that we need to revise standard accounts of American federalism. That's this first point. That America's constitutional tradition reflects a commitment to protective, redistributive government, not only suspicion of the state, and that constitutions, when sufficiently flexible and detailed, can disempower courts. In sum, by attending to state-level lawmaking, in addition to federal constitutional developments, we derive a fuller and more accurate picture of the American constitutional order. It is characterized by continuous competition between those who hold rival constitutional visions. This is true not only at the level of ideas, but also at the level of institutions, as these competing visions have been institutionalized at different levels of government. As historian Grace Mallon has argued in her work on the early republic, there was never a neat division between national and state spheres of authority. Americans worked out who should do what, not by theorizing from first principles, but through ad hoc negotiations, conducted to meet the exigencies of the moment. Her work focuses on the interactions between state and federal officials, but a similar dynamic has also characterized movement politics. Movements do not make claims in the abstract about which powers belong to the states and which to the federal government, or about which government does a better job of expressing the popular will. Nor, as the segregationist use of states so clearly demonstrates, are state lawmakers necessarily going to protect the liberty of their own people against federal overreach. We certainly hear these arguments, but they are almost always advanced in the service of particular policy commitments. So rather than continuing to debate the merits of these instrumental claims, we might more fruitfully ask why states have been such powerful instruments in the hands of opposition movements. So far, I have answered that question by describing the institutional calculations that drove movements to target state law and to refashion state constitutions. They can limit the discretion of judges, they can demand that the state offer forms of protection, and we can see in these examples constitutions acting like Ulysses' ropes, binding office holders. But I think there is an additional answer, one that understands constitutional law not only as a constraint on politics, but also as a powerful resource for those making moral claims. The very concept of law, as Professor H.L.A. Hart explained, is distinguished from other forms of coercion by the law follower's own internal sense of obligation. Hart famously rejected the idea that law is simply a command backed by force. Imagine being held at gunpoint and complying with the gunman's instructions. This, Hart pointed out, is not a satisfying account of the way law operates. Or in his words, law surely is not the gunman situation writ large. Law does not simply coerce conduct, it also justifies that conduct. Hart explains, officials and private persons who accept the rules use them as standards for the appraisal of their own and others' behavior. This internal point of view is, I think, essential to understanding each of the constitutional developments I have described today. State lawmaking mattered because officials and citizens treated state laws as authoritative sources of justification. Movements not only exploited the institutional opportunities available to them, but also harnessed the legitimating force of law. Of course, in this same work, Hart also argued that a legal system relies on a rule of recognition to establish what counts as law. So a rule of recognition is a social rule, a social fact, that tells those operating within a legal system which other rules are valid, which are legal. My argument here puts a little bit of pressure on that picture. I have emphasized not the clarity and hierarchy that a rule of recognition establishes, but instead the messiness, the conflicts between different visions and the legal institutions that express them. These conflicts have been central to America's constitutional development, and I think they may also be important to its present. When the federal government was the primary bastion of civil rights, conflict between state and federal law sustained a deeply unjust system. But in this political moment, when the federal government seems set on a path of de-democratization and racial exclusion, it is surely welcome news that pluralism is a defining feature of the American constitutional order, that there are other venues from which to nurture and advance competing visions. Thank you.